The Magicka Sorcerer is quite possibly one of the best classes that you can choose for early play in the Elder Scrolls Online. This class is capable of doing insane damage, while also being near indestructible. Being able to just sit there and soak in damage in veteran content. This video is going to give the best 2 beginner builds for the Mag Sorc that I've come across, offering setups that are super easy to put together and even more simple to use. Most of the footage that you'll see in this video is from the Heavy Attack Sorc, a setup that uses no trial gear and does enough damage to achieve both the trifectas in each solo arena. We have no time to waste, so let's get into it. To start this video, we are going to discuss some basic elements that all 3 setups share. This includes the race, Mundus, and Attributes, but first, we need to understand how to optimize this build a little bit more for certain situations. And the 2 most important stats for PvE damage dealing on the Mag Sorc are Penetration and Critical Damage. Penetration is a stat that fights directly against armor. Dungeon and Trial enemies all have 18,200 armor, and solo arena enemies vary a little bit, having anywhere between 8k and 18,200 armor. This armor value decreases the amount of damage that you do to that enemy significantly, and Penetration is a stat that represents how much of that armor we ignore. So in most situations, getting our penetration to 18,200 is going to be one of the best ways that we can increase our damage, but going over that at all is going to add literally 0 value. Critical damage is the modifier that tells us how much increased damage we do when we hit a critical strike. This is separate from crit chance, which is a stat that measures how likely we are to hit a critical strike. We start with a base crit damage value of 50%, so when we crit, we will do 50% more damage with it. This number can go all the way to 125%, which ends up being an insanely massive increase to our damage output. But again, like penetration, this is capped, so going over 125% will have 0 value. The reason that we need to know this is because the game does a very poor job of indicating how much of these stats we actually have. The character sheet is very unreliable. For example, it doesn't even show the base 50% crit damage that each character starts out with, only the stats that we add onto it. In addition to this, in 4-man and in 12-man content, the tanks and healers usually provide a ton of buffs and debuffs that increase both our penetration and our critical damage, none of which is reflected in the character sheet. A debuff like Major Breach, for example, which decreases target armor by 6k, will only affect the target and not buff our actual stats, so again, it won't appear in that character sheet. So on console, we need to do a little bit of math, and on PC, we can use the add-on Combat Metrics to tell us what these values actually are. This is important because these builds are built around the 21 mil dummy, which offers the most common buffs and debuffs that we should be receiving in these environments. If you don't want to rely on these, that's totally okay. I'll provide some alternatives at the end of each build that maximize these stats a bit better so that you don't have to rely on anybody else. However, this is ESO, and teamwork is encouraged and by far the best way to tackle content. As an important note though, just because these are the best and the most important stats doesn't mean that these are the stats that we solely attempt to maximize. Since they both have a cap, we will optimize our damage the best by getting as close to these caps as possible, but going over them will likely mean that we can allocate some resources into some other stats to optimize our damage a bit further. So with all of that out of the way, both of these builds will share race, Mundus, and attribute points. For our race, the one that we choose will have a very minimal impact on our overall DPS output, and you really can just choose whatever you like. That said, High Elf will technically provide the most damage out of any of the options, giving max resources and weapon and spell damage. But if you plan on doing 4-man or solo content the most often, then Khajiit will probably be the strongest option, as it gives some crit damage, a stat that's a little bit harder to come by with just 1 or 4 players. As a final option, Orc is a really solid choice that offers a nice balance between survivability and damage. This race gives about as much weapon and spell damage as High Elf, but also offers some max health and a nice heal that occurs whenever you do damage with a very short cooldown. For our Mundus, we will be opting to run the Thief, which will provide a much needed increase to our critical chance. However, you could consider the Lover if you need some extra pen, or the Shadow if you need some extra crit damage. Though I do feel that these options should be very rarely considered. For our attributes, we will be dumping all of our points into Magicka. Our damage will scale, meaning increase, based on how high our weapon and spell damage stats are, as well as how high our max resource pool is. Damage scales off of the highest of these stats, so we want to spend our resources building just one of these stats in each category, so weapon or spell damage, stamina or Magicka. And putting all of our attribute points into Magicka is the way that we're going to increase our damage the most. This build is also very tanky, so we really shouldn't need any points into health, and we gain our survivability from many other sources. And with that, getting into our first build, the ever so popular heavy attack Sorc. I was able to get 95k DPS on the dummy with literally just 3 buttons. I've seen some more complicated versions of this do a little bit better, but this is by far the easiest strong damage that you can have in the game. This is a good entry level build that I would suggest for normal or veteran dungeons and trials, and can even do a lot of the hard modes in the game. However, anything above that, including the later hard modes like Dreadsail, Sanity's Edge, or Rockgrove, I'd suggest going with something that can do a bit more damage. As a final note, we will start by discussing the build as is, optimized for 4-man and 12-man content, and then I'll discuss what few changes you should make to optimize this build a little bit better for solo content right after. For our gear, we'll be opting to run Sergeant's Mail from the dungeon Wayrest Sewers, paired with the new craftable set from Gold Road Highland Sentinel. We'll pair these sets with One Piece Slime Craw, also from Wayrest Sewers, and the Oaken Soul Mythic. Sergeant and Oaken Soul are the obvious gear choices for the heavy attack Sorc, with Sergeant dramatically increasing the damage of our heavy attacks, and Oaken Soul giving us 1,000,000 damage in survivability based buffs. But Highland Sentinel is the lesser known choice. This set provides a ton of critical chance, building stacks of crit chance every second that you are in combat. The catch is that whenever you move, you lose half the stacks that you've built. This may seem very silly at first, but take a look at the footage from these solo arena trifectas. There is no piece of content in the game that should require more movement than a solo arena. You are the only thing that the enemies have to target. But throughout probably 80 to 90% of each arena, we're able to keep full stacks of this set. This build is just so tanky that we literally can just sit there and take all of the damage that's thrown in us, even standing in red AoEs. Don't worry though, even if you have to move and you can't get 10 full stacks out of the set, having even 3 to 5 stacks on average makes it one of, if not the best option that we can run for this build. Moving and losing stacks isn't really a damage detriment. The 2 through 4 piece set bonuses offer crit chance, so either way, we're going to be getting that at all times, and then you will always have 2 to 3 stacks of the set anyway. Our body pieces should be run in all divines with max Magicka enchants. Our lightning staff should be charged with a flame damage enchant, and our jewelry should be bloodthirsty with spell damage enchants. For our skills, my focus was on making this build as easy to play as possible. We will opt to run Twilight Tormentor, a skill that we will never actually cast, but that will do a ton of passive damage, as well as Bound Aegis and Inner Light, 2 buff skills that will give us more damage than any other ability that we could slot, without ever having to cast them. Bound Aegis provides an 8% increase to our max Magicka pool, and Inner Light provides a 7% increase to our max Magicka pool via the skill itself, and the passive Magicka controller in the Mages Guild tree, which adds 2% max mag for every Mages Guild ability slotted. These skills will never be cast, and just passively increase our damage done, with maybe the exception being Bound Aegis, where when you do cast it, you gain a 40% increase in your block mitigation, meaning that attacks that might chunk your health now just tickle whenever you cast the ability and block. The only 2 skills that we will cast throughout this parse, though, are Volatile Familiar and Daedric Prey. Our Familiar, when we cast it, will do a ton of increased damage and do that damage in an AoE radius, making it just a strong damage over time effect. Daedric Prey, on the other hand, will increase the amount of damage that our pets do by 45%. And on top of that, do a ton of damage on its own, outputting more DPS than the Scamp. Finally, for our ultimate, the strongest ult that the Sorc has access to is the Charged Storm Atronach. This ult blows up enemies with ticks of damage that occur in an AoE radius, and this ability will pretty dramatically increase our damage done with the charge status effect as well, a status effect with the Sorc that is uniquely strong, and in this build will deal nearly as much damage as the Scamp on its own. The last few miscellaneous details of this build: for our food, we will get the most damage out of the green max mag food option, since it provides the most max mag out of any of our choices. However, I usually run the blue bistat food choices, since they offer just just a little bit less max mag, but offer a ton of max health, making this build even tankier in content. And it's this food option in combination with Oaken Soul, Bound Aegis, and our potions that make this build indestructible. And with that, for our potions, we will combine Mud Crab Chitin, Mountain Flower, and Bug Loss to create an Essence of Health that will restore health when used, and increase our physical and spell resistances by about 4k. This will put us at near tank level resistances, especially in 12-man content where we will be provided with Major Resolve, which will nearly put us at the 32k resistance cap. For our champion points, we will opt to run Deadly Aim and Weapons Expert to increase our damage done with our heavy attacks, Backstabber or Fighting Finesse to help us reach that 125% crit damage cap, and Exploiter in 12-man content. Exploiter is the strongest blue CP that we can slot, but only assuming that your support can keep solid uptimes with the off-balance debuff. If this is not being maintained, I would suggest slotting Wrathful Strikes instead. Red and green CP truly are preference, but if you want to know what I'm running, for my red CP in this build, I usually opt for Celerity, Expert Evasion, Boundless Vitality, and Fortified, with these options occasionally changing depending on the content. The green tree will not affect this build at all, so truly run whatever you prefer. And with that, as mentioned earlier, this build is optimized for 4 and 12-man content. If you are planning on doing primarily solo content, this build will do fine as is, but you can get a bit more damage by making just a few small changes. I would go with the Khajiit Race, as well as replace Highland Sentinel with another craftable set from High Isle, Order's Wrath, which will give a little bit less critical chance, but both of these changes will result in far more critical damage, which will be worth the trade-off, since we have to build into the stat on our own. I would also make the Lightning Staff infused instead of charged, and run a Crusher enchant instead of a Flame enchant, for a little bit of extra penetration. Skill-wise, I would remove Inner Light in favor of Elemental Susceptibility, a skill in the Destruction Staff tree, which is a long 30-second dot that will provide the largest penetration debuff in the game, Major Breach, decreasing target's armor value by nearly 6k. The ability itself will also do some decent damage, proccing the Burning, Chilled, and Concussed status effects once every 7.5 seconds. I would also remorph the Twilight Tormentor into the Twilight Matriarch, which will give us a massive burst heal. And when we're in 4 and 12-man content with the healer, especially with our resistances, we don't really need a heal on our own. But in solo content, we should probably have some source of healing. Finally, I would run Wrathful Strikes instead of Exploiter, since we don't have a reliable way of keeping off balance up on our own. And finally, the rotation. Maximizing damage on any class involves casting skills dynamically, which means that you should watch your timers and simply reapply an ability when its timer runs out. On the heavy attack Sorc, we always prioritize the heavy attack. I literally never let go of my right trigger during a fight. A heavy attack takes 2 seconds, so when it starts channeling, if I look at my ability timers and see that any ability is under 1 second, while I'm channeling the heavy attack, I just start spamming that button so that it's reapplied as soon as the channel ends. If the skill has over 2 seconds, I'll rip another heavy attack and then reapply the skill after. If this feels too tricky, I recommend the static rotation while you get your feet wet with the class. Start with a pre-buff of Tormentor, Scamp, then drop your ultimate, and then you'll go into the rotation, which simply goes Pray, heavy attack 3 times, Pray, heavy attack 3 times, Pray, heavy attack 2 times, Scamp, and repeat. Simply cast your ultimate whenever it's ready. If you do all of this, you will have no trouble reaching 90k, with the max potential for this build sitting around 96 to 97 with really good crit RNG. Our second build that we're going to discuss is a tad more complicated, but will do quite a bit more damage. This 1-bar build is a good transition to the next level of the Mag Sorc, outputting around 110k DPS on the dummy, and being solid enough to take into some of the earlier trifectas in the game even, such as the Hoff trifecta or the Kind's Aegis trifecta. This build can even be run with great success in solo content, with a few small changes that we'll discuss at the end of the main build. For our gear, we'll be opting to run Perfected Bosses Mania, a set from the trial Rock Grove, paired with the craftable Highland Sentinel, as well as the Oaken Soul Mythic and One Piece Slime Crop. Boss A is a really solid set, providing up to about an 11% increase in our damage done whenever we keep our mag pool low enough. This is very easy to do in this build since we primarily run the stamina-based spammable rapid strikes. But if you have no interest in playing this Magicka minigame, I got near identical results with the dungeon set Aegis Collar, so if you want to use that instead, you totally can, with little to no penalty. Highland Sentinel, as discussed with the previous build, is a set that offers a ton of critical chance in the form of stacks that build once per second while you're in combat. These stacks half themselves whenever you move though. As demonstrated in Vadistran Hollows and the Maelstrom Arena, two pieces of content where you might assume that you would need to move around very often, you'll see that we're able to keep over 5 stacks of this setup very consistently. And it is very possible to run the set this way and even get more value out of it in 12-man content. The thing that makes this set so strong though is that you don't even need to get the full value out of it for it to be the best option. An average of 5 stacks makes the set incredibly strong, so if you do need to move, you really won't lose that much damage. Slimecraw is the strongest one-piece monster bonus in the game, found from the dungeon Wayrest 1. And the Oakensoul Mythic is the go-to for 1-bar builds, since it takes away our 2nd bar in exchange for a ton of different buffs. We will run the Divine trait with max Magicka enchants on the body, daggers that are both charged with 1 flame and 1 poison enchant for our weapon, and the Bloodthirsty trait with spell damage enchants on our jewelry. For our skills, we will opt to run the Twilight Tormentor, a skill that we will never actually cast, but just allow to do a ton of passive damage on its own, as well as our 2nd pet, the Volatile Familiar, a pet that will also do passive damage, but also give us very strong AoE utility whenever we activate it. Both of these pets, and Aegis Collar by the way, if we choose to run that set, will get buffed by our next skill, Daedric Prey, which increases the damage of pets by 45%. Prey will not only buff these skills and our ultimate, but it will also do more damage than the Scamp or the Tormentor, making this ability an absolute no-brainer. Our other 2 skills work pretty nicely together as spammables, with our primary spammable being Rapid Strikes. This is just straight up one of the strongest spammables in the game, and is a must-have for the Sorc, made even better in a 2-bar setup when we get to pair it with the Maelstrom Greatsword. Our last ability, Crystal Frags, we can use as a spammable if we need to if we get low on stamina, but we mainly use it for the frag proc, which is a more powerful version of the ability that has a 33% chance to proc whenever we cast a non-ultimate ability. The proc can hit up to 90k with Bloodthirsty in full effect, providing some insane burst damage. Finally, our ultimate of choice, the Charged Storm Atronach, will be the best option for the Magicka Sorcerer, providing a ton of damage in an AoE radius, as well as dealing additional damage via the Concuss status effect, especially with our double-charged daggers, which will result in the Concuss status effect doing nearly as much damage as some of our full abilities. Getting into the last few miscellaneous details of the build, for our food, we will get the most damage out of the green max mag food choices, since they provide the most max mag out of any other food. However, I usually run one of the blue buy-stat food options, since they offer just a little bit less max magicka, but offer a ton of max health. And it's this food option in combination with Oakensoul and our potions that make this build super beefy. And with that, for our potions, we do need a way to restore stamina. And there is no potion combination in the game that will give us stamina in both physical and spell resistances. So we will combine Mudcrab Chitin, Columbine, and Mountain Flower, and at least get the physical resistances with a way to restore stamina. We should play just a bit more cautiously in fights where we take damage that will primarily affect our spell resistances. For our champion points, we will opt to run Deadly Aim and Master at Arms to primarily boost the damage done with our strongest sources of damage, Rapid Strikes, and our frag procs, as well as either Backstabber or Fighting Finesse to ensure that we can reach that 125% crit damage cap in 12-man content. Our Flex CP Exploiter will be the strongest boost in damage that we can run from any of the blue champion slottables, but this is only the case if our tanks and healers are keeping solid uptimes with the off-balance debuff. If you're not sure that this is the case, you can run Wrathful Strikes instead. And with that, as mentioned earlier, this build is optimized for 4 and 12-man content. If you are planning on primarily doing solo content, this build will do fine as is, with maybe the exception of needing a heal. But you can get a little bit more damage by making a few small changes. I would go with the Khajiit Race, as well as the craftable Order's Wrath over Highland Sentinel, which will give us a little bit less crit chance, but both of these options will give us a lot more crit damage, a stat that's essential for us to source on our own when we are solo. Skill-wise, I would would probably remove the Scamp in favor of Razor Caltrops to make sure that we have a source of the strongest penetration debuff in the game, Major Breach. If you find that this is too stamina demanding, you can also just replace Rapid Strikes with Razor Caltrops and use Crystal Frags as a spammable. I would also remorph the Twilight Tormentor to the Twilight Matriarch, which sacrifices a very small amount of damage but gives us access to a massive burst heal. Finally, I would definitely run Wrathful Strikes over Exploiter since we will have no way to keep the off-balance debuff up on our own. Finally, for our rotation, this one is a tad more complicated than the heavy attack Sorc build, but usually the more complicated the rotation, the more damage that you're going to get out of it. As with any rotation, maximizing damage involves casting skills dynamically, which means that you should watch your timers and simply reapply abilities whenever that timer runs out, using your spammable in between when nothing needs to be reapplied. This does take a bit of practice though, so in the meantime, if you would prefer, here's a static rotation that I'd recommend using while you're getting comfortable with the class. Start with a pre-buff of Tormentor, Scamp, then throw your ultimate, and then begin the actual rotation, which goes Daedric Prey, spam 5 times, Daedric Prey, spam 5 times, Daedric Prey, spam 4 times, Scamp, and repeat. You will simply cast your ultimate whenever it is ready and use your frag proc in place of a spammable cast whenever it is ready. If you are using Bosse, make sure that you dump your Magicka pool to about 15 to 20% before starting a fight. You should be able to maintain about 10 to 15% Magicka just by casting Prey, frag proc, and Scamp whenever they are ready to be applied. This can get a little tricky though, so again, if you don't want to worry about playing this Magicka minigame, you can run Aegis Caller expecting just a 2k DPS difference at most. And while both of these builds can easily get you through just about any piece of content in the game, if you have any interest in getting into the most difficult content at any point in your ESO career, like Trifectas in the Trial Rockgrove, Dreadsail Reef, Sanity's Edge, or the new Trial Lucent Citadel, the unfortunate reality is that the easiest way to get these Trifectas is by doing an ungodly amount of damage as a group. Enough to skip the mechanics that make these trials so tough, or even make those mechanics last for a much shorter period of time. That is, if you don't want to be stuck in the same piece of content for months and months and months of progression. This is done with really strong group optimization, planning out even the smallest details, as well as having a mastery level of understanding of the class and how to maximize its damage, which is something that this video will do, teaching you how to get up to 150k DPS out of the Magicka Sorcerer, as well as explaining how to optimize the various trial setups that you might utilize.